All right. Welcome back. This is episode 212. Last week, we began our three-part series on divorce, and this week, we are continuing that discussion. This week, we're going to be talking about the financial steps to take during divorce, and this week, I'm joined by a special guest, Renée Bauer. Renée is an attorney with Happy Even After Family Law, located in Hamden, Connecticut. She's a graduate of Suffolk Law and has been practicing law since 2003. She's also the author of 2 books, Divorce in Connecticut, and her most recent book, She Wins, and also the host of the Happy Even After podcast. So she's very busy. She's here to discuss the financial steps to take when going through divorce. Welcome, Renée.
Thank you for having me. Let's do this.
Yeah, I'm excited to continue this discussion. Obviously, divorce is not a fun thing to go through, but it can be very stressful, both just, from the family aspect and the relationship side, but from the financial side too. So that's what I want to focus on today.
Yeah, and that's usually the thing that brings the people the most stress, is because once they they find themselves in the process of divorce, they're like, what does life look like on the other side of it? Will I have enough money? Will I get enough money? What will happen with all of our assets? And so that's the thing that causes the most anxiety for people.
Yeah, I could imagine. So last week, I discussed trying to get really prepared financially, especially if one spouse has been the one maybe that handles the finances, right? And maybe the spouse that you're working with is the one that didn't handle the finances, So getting organized, figuring out where things are at, and assuming you've done that, like as you've filed for divorce and maybe someone's now working with you or another attorney, like what do they need to think about financially?
Yeah, so the first step is what you talked about, and what your last episode was first just gathering all of your information, right? Like putting it together. And a lot of times there's always one person in the relationship who is the financial person. And the other spouse will say, well, my spouse always handled it. And it's not always the man or the woman, like those roles really depend on just the dynamic of that relationship. But once you put all of your information together, you're sitting with the lawyer, and the lawyer says to you, okay, now we need to gather all of those documents because there's something called financial disclosure that has to happen in the process. Before we can talk about settlement, before we go to court, before we negotiate anything, we need to actually know what there is. And that's where the lawyers get in and make all of those requests for everything that you started to put together. Now they're going to ask for it, and it has to be shared in a formal process, which is tax returns and bank statements and credit card statements and crypto statements, which is one of the things that we see coming up. I mean, and that's, it's crazy because that's the thing that like a lot of divorce lawyers aren't talking about, and the financial affidavits don't actually ask for that asset. But it's big because people are dabbling in that world anymore. So what's happening over there? And that financial information gets exchanged between the parties, hopefully transparently. There's always things that sometimes it doesn't happen, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. But that's that first step that really kicks the divorce into motion to let things start to happen and negotiations and settlement talks start to occur.
So you mentioned it about hopefully that's disclosed. So how does that work? Let's say one spouse believes the other one isn't being truthful about what they have, or maybe they find out after the fact. Like, how is that handled? Yeah, and we'll see that with a lot of self-employed people. So it's really easy. If you're a W-2 wage earner, it's easy. We can follow the paper trail of what the income is and the tax. Like, that's the simple stuff. But often when you have someone who doesn't have such a neat and tidy financial picture, then it takes a little bit more digging. And those are the cases that we see. Sometimes you'll have someone not want to be fully forthcoming with all of that. And we're asking for additional documents such as corporate tax returns. We're asking for the bank records. Sometimes we're bringing in a forensic accountant to figure out what is somebody's earnings actually, not just what they're pulling, not just what they're taking home, because just because their income says they're bringing X home, we know that other expenses are getting run through that have to be recaptured as income. So if someone decides that they're not going to play ball and they're not going to be upfront, there's mechanisms that lawyers can do to make sure someone does disclose that. We can go to court. We can ask the judge to make orders. We can ask the judge to penalize someone until they fully comply. We can ask for attorney's fees. So judges do not take
it lightly if someone is not being transparent or fully disclosing all of the financials. And usually they take really swift action when the lawyers bring it to their attention in order to make that happen, because the case is stuck until we have that full disclosure.
So let's assume the disclosures have been made, everything is up to where it should be. What's usually then the next step in the process?
So it depends on what your case looks like, but usually what I like to do is we have everything. I like to do an assessment of what is there, what kind of assets do we have, did we have the pensions valued, are we looking at retirement accounts, or let's compare apples to apples as to what there are for assets, and then I sit with the client and say, what are your goals? And I won't come to the table and say, here's what I think you should do, because I really want to understand what is it that's really important to them. So then we can have that conversation about how to accomplish not all of them, because no one's getting everything on their wish list, but maybe the top couple things. And often we'll hear, well, I really want the house. And so then that conversation is, well, is that a smart decision? Do you want the house because it's an emotional attachment, or do you want the house because it makes sense because the interest rates are so high and your mortgage is so inexpensive, and so it makes sense to keep you there? And we start to look at settlement options that align with what that person's goals are, which that gives us the opportunity to get a little bit creative, where a judge might just slice everything down the middle and say, they're not creative, but now we know, if that's that person's major goal is to stay in the house, keep the interest rates low because rent is going to cost more than the mortgage, then we can start to look at trade-offs for that and how to make that happen. So that first step, and it's so important when people select attorneys, to make sure that they have someone that they can have those open conversations with, who are actually listening to what their goals are, because it's not uncommon for lawyers to be like, okay, here's what we have, this is what we're going to do to divide it, and not paying attention to be like, listen, you're not just a case, you're not just a number. What does life look like for you on the other side of that, and how can we make things as smooth as possible? And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're treating it the same way we treated the other 5 cases.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's important. So if we focus on the house, for example, right? Let's say there's a house and one spouse wants to keep the house. If they do keep the house, you mentioned the mortgage. I was curious, do they get to take over the mortgage? And if they do, would it have to be a joint mortgage, or if it was in the other spouse's name, could they assume that?
So, Ryan, what's so interesting about that question is, had it been 3 years ago, I would have answered it really differently. And the typical thing that would happen is someone refinances, buys the other person out, and removes their name from the mortgage. Simple. Now with the interest rates, it's becoming often unaffordable for people to do that, and they don't want the 7 or 8% interest rate, because now the house isn't affordable. So families and couples are looking at what's the goal? Maybe it's to keep the kids in the home until they graduate from high school, and then they sell that. And a lot of people are agreeing to keep both of their names on the mortgage. And until some other event happens, interest rates dip to something, there's a certain life change, someone gets remarried, or the kids are older, and then dividing the equity at that point. And then that opens a can of worms for what that next conversation. Is it full equity, or is it just equity, a value that we determine as of the date of the divorce? But what happens if someone's not paying the mortgage? Does that trigger a sale? Does that trigger the refinance? So now there's a lot more nuances that didn't exist before, when it was much simpler. You just refinance and we all move on. But families have to get really creative now because of the current market.
That's true. I didn't think of that. Let's say one spouse had the mortgage in their name. They can't just assign it to the other spouse, right? So that's off the table. So they'd either have to leave it in that spouse's name or do a refinance, right, to put it in the other spouse's name, which can be problematic.
And then the other person, has to accept the fact that they're probably not going to be able to go buy anything else so long as their name is on that house. And that's a decision that it's a compromise that they have to make. And sometimes it doesn't work. And when you have high conflict, the parties are forced to sell because they can't reach in that agreement. And now we're seeing situations where just rentals are so expensive. And the reality is they're paying more in rent than they are in the mortgage, but they're not able to work together to reach some sort of resolution.
Definitely. Yeah, because then there's a concern, right, that you mentioned. okay, I'm in the house, but, or, you know, I'm supposed to be paying the mortgage, right? What if you don't? And then the other spouse, it's on their credit.
Yeah.
Their credit's going to get affected.
Yep.
The house could get foreclosed. You know, if they didn't have good communication, maybe one day they read in the paper that the house is having a foreclosure sale. So there's a lot that can go wrong with that.
And we always try to put language in place that both of them will have access to the mortgage statement so they can check online that it's being paid. Sometimes we're even doing situations where instead of an alimony or child support payment, that other person is paying the mortgage, even though they're not in the house. So these are all the creative solutions that we now have to think about that weren't an issue before, and that really judges are not doing, because the judge is not going to come up with a solution like that. They're going to be a very clean break. They're going to say, how do we separate and untangle these people? But the lawyers have an opportunity to do something a little bit different, so long as you have two people who also have a common goal.
Okay, you say you go through this, and then in like 7 years, the children are going to be out of high school, and now you're going to sell. Like, how do you handle that? Are you really not divorced, or how does that work?
Oh, you're divorced, all right. You just have a house that you co-own together. And so what I like to do is you put the value on the house as of the date of the divorce. You carve out what that person's equity that they would be entitled to as if they sold the house now. And then that's the number that they'll get regardless of what happens to the value of the house 7 years down the road. Because what if a new roof is needed and the other person who's living there puts that money in? But sometimes you have situations where those expenses will continue to be shared as well. And for that, then maybe the full equity gets divided because that person is still contributing in some capacity.
Yeah, there's a lot to work out there. What happens, I know we're all thinking, oh, the real estate market is going to keep going up, but what if it goes down? And now you said, okay, you're owed $200,000 equity, but there isn't $200,000 equity in the house when you go to sell it.
That's one of those conversations that we have to have about what's the risk of doing this. And, you know, I've always been the person that said, why are you holding on to the house if it's an emotional attachment? Like, have a clean break. Don't just stay in it to stay in it. But when someone really feels that it's that important for them to stay in it, or economically it makes sense, that's a conversation that has to be looked at. What type of equity are we even talking about? You know, is there enough? Like, there should be enough built into it that it feels like a comfortable number no matter what happens, that they'll still be able to pull that equity out. But it definitely opens up all kinds of potential problems. Because what if someone decides to take an equity line and the other person doesn't know about it?
You have no control over that if it's not in your name, potentially, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I guess it can be, you know, a good idea, but there's a lot of, potential risks with doing that, right? Yeah.
And it keeps you tangled up together. And that's the thing that I don't like about it, because what we try to do is just unravel everything so it's a clean break. And this keeps you, whether you want to or not, tangled up and having to communicate. And for some people, that's just not possible.
Yeah, that can be difficult. What about businesses? How does that work? Let's say you talked about self-employed. Somebody owns a business. Let's say they started the business before they met their spouse, and now they're married and they get divorced, but and the business grew a lot when they were with their spouse. Like, how is that handled?
Yeah. And it all depends on what kind of business. So if we're talking about mom and pop shop, like let's use a landscaper, for example, because that's one I feel like we see a lot. But let's say it's one person who started with his lawnmower, and now he built it up and he has a workforce. But at the end of the day, if he removed himself from the business, everything would collapse. So there's probably very little value to that business. And now we're looking at it as to what is his income, what is his true income from this business, in order to figure out what support or alimony should be, versus a business that has grown and maybe there's 50 employees, and maybe the person who started the business who's getting divorced actually isn't even needed in the business, and the business will continue to thrive if they get removed from it. Maybe now we're looking at the value of the business and talking about a potential buyout. And so much of that, we always hear stories too of someone built the business and the other person was the at-home
Sure.
support, because that person was working 80 hours a week, and the other person was taking care of the kids because of that person. So those are the nuances that will help us have that conversation as to whether a buyout of the business is something that we should be looking at. And if that's the case, we need the business value to find out what this business is actually worth.
So potential business valuation if it's, not just solo owner operator, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I look at it like it's easy for me to dig into somebody's business bank records and P&Ls. And when it gets really complicated and when there's a lot going on, I'm like, okay, now it's time to bring in an expert. If it's more than just one bank account and one
Sure.
tax return, like it's easy for anyone who's not a financial professional to look at that. But as it gets more complicated, then I like to bring people in who are able to really put their eagle eye on that and really assess what that person's real income is, what the business value is. Are they actually even paying themselves adequately? It's not uncommon for someone's income to automatically start to drop
Sure.
as the divorce is
Yeah.
filed, and they're like, hey, the business just isn't doing
Yeah.
as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. So let's say the business was worth something, right? It's worth, $2 million. And so that gets counted on the financial disclosure worksheet, or what do you call it? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, the financial affidavit, the business value
Yeah.
goes on there. And it doesn't mean that the other person is going to own
Sure.
half the business. It doesn't mean that there's going to be a buyout of $1 million, but it means we have to consider it with everything else. And so now maybe we're trading assets with that. Maybe there's equity in a house that the other person
Sure.
is keeping, and they're not buying the other person out because that person is retaining all of the equity in their business. So then we can start to sort of horse trade with assets.
So are there, I guess, being that we're in Connecticut, there's probably laws, right, in each state that pertain to what a spouse is entitled to? Is that the case, or?
So most, and obviously I can't speak outside of Connecticut, but what I do know is most states abide by the fair and equitable division of assets, which doesn't
Okay.
tell you anything. It tells you the whim
Yeah.
of the judge. But they're looking at what makes sense and what's fair. In Connecticut, for example, if someone comes into a marriage and has $5 million of assets and they don't have a prenup, those assets are not automatically just part of the marital
Okay.
estate. We can kind of carve some of that off and say, whatever you brought into the marriage is separate, and we're only going to look at what was accumulated during the marriage, prenup or no
Okay.
prenup. The courts
That's a
tend to
Connecticut
do
law,
that.
or,
Retirement assets.
Or that's, yeah.
So it's actually
Oh,
not
okay.
even a law. It's just the practice of what
Sure.
we see happen. So it's not uncommon for retirement assets, for example, your 401k, your 457, your pension, for us to look at and gather the information as to what's premarital. That comes off the top, and now we're only dividing the what was
Sure.
acquired during the marriage. So that's common
Okay.
practice. The judges don't have to do that. They can do something else if they think it's not fair and equitable to
Okay.
do that. So, and that's that's why I have a job, right?
Sure.
Because it's not so black and white, and it's not, people come in with these different nuances and different experiences and different stories and different financials and all of that, which is why people go and litigate.
Yeah.
It's why we have trials, is because it's not so clear cut as to what we're supposed to do with this.
Sure. So assets before might not be counted. So in that case, you'd probably want to have good records, because if you don't have any
Yes.
records of what you had before, right, that could be problematic.
Yep.
And so, once you've gone through that, then the parties need to usually come to an agreement, or does the court decide that, or how does that work?
The court will schedule it for a pretrial, which is the lawyers going in, sitting with the judge, and the judge is looking at all of the, a limited version of the financials, looking at the financial affidavit, looking at what each person wants based on what their lawyers put together, and making a recommendation. So you're not getting a ton of the judge's time. You're maybe spending a half hour there, so they're not getting the full
Sure.
story, but they're trying to help you get to an agreement. And most cases settle at that point, because because the lawyers leave, they have conversations with their clients. The clients get sometimes a reality check as to maybe that thing that I really wanted is not reasonable for me to ask for. Or at that point, the parties are deciding we can't reach an agreement and the court's scheduling trial dates.
Okay, so you can't reach an agreement, then the judge decides? Or, I mean, I've seen that movie, The Wedding Crashers. I don't know if you've seen the beginning of it. Forget the rest of the movie, but the beginning, I think they're arbitrators, right? Divorce arbitrators. Is that a real thing, or does that not really happen?
Well, yeah. So you have, Connecticut has a program called Special Masters, which is essentially like a mediator that tries to help you resolve, but that's not the judge. If you go to a trial and the judge is hearing all of the evidence, you don't have a jury. It's a bench trial. It's just the judge making the decision. Everyone's putting their case on, telling the story of the marriage, saying how awful their spouse is. It's an exercise in paper. It's a lot of like, here are all of the tax returns and the bank statements and all of that. Trying to prove that the other person is at fault is often something that happens, and then the judge ultimately decides what happens with all of the assets and whether fault is an issue or not, and whether even if a person is at fault, if it impacts any of the financial orders.
Okay, so then at the conclusion of that, the judge kind of decides, like, if you couldn't work it out before, well, here's what's going to happen.
Yeah. Yep. And it wouldn't be uncommon for us to be a day or two into trial and then we reach an agreement. I mean, that's happened because as the evidence starts to come out, each side says, the story that I was telling myself isn't necessarily coming across so well. So they start to see the writing on the wall, or they start to see the holes in whatever their case theory is. And then the lawyers come back and say, okay, let's figure out how to resolve this now. And so that agreement happens at some point in the middle of that trial.
So somebody might have more leverage than the other as the case unfolds and is willing to make a deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, listen, everyone goes to trial thinking that they have the best case until they're on the witness stand, and all of a sudden, the judge is kind of glaring at them as the evidence comes out and their testimony comes out.
So, like you mentioned, retirement assets, obviously I deal a lot with that. Like, those are part of the process as well, and how's that work?
Yeah. Oh, it's the hard pill to swallow sometimes. Retirement assets that are accumulated during the marriage are often on the table to be divided. Doesn't happen all the time, but usually as a starting point, it's looking at what those assets are, and that happens through a qualified domestic relations order called a quadro, so there aren't any tax implications. But the idea is that both parties will have somewhat equal footing for retirement assets at the end of the divorce. And the person who has been saving, and this is where it gets like really, really hard, is because sometimes you have someone who just saves, and they have pride in building up their investment account, and the other person's a spender, and all of a sudden the spender is like, well, I want half of your $1 million investment account, and that person's like, but wait a second, I've been saving,
I've been telling you to
spending.
save. You never listened.
Exactly. How is that fair? And it might not be fair, but the court's going to shrug their shoulders and be like, well, this was the arrangement that the two of you had, and you lived this way for a really long time. So
so it is.
I
mean, I obviously see a lot of different couples, and sometimes there is a spender and a saver, and sometimes I'm asked to counsel them. I'm like, that goes beyond what my ability is.
Yeah.
I can tell you.
It's
hard because it's hard. It's hard to change that mindset sometimes. So, yeah.
I always tell people before you get married, have those conversations about money and know who is the spender, who's the saver, and how do you keep both of those people happy? Like, the spender gets a little bit of discretionary that no questions asked, and the saver feels like their goals are being met as well. But a lot of people are too busy picking out their flowers in their honeymoon location to have those hard conversations, but it can save so much on the back end.
Yeah, money's an important part of all relationships. So pensions as well, is a pension potentially like, okay, I've got a pension of $6,000 a month when I retire. Would your spouse, be equal to half of that, or is there a formula? Or
Potentially, and it will depend on the length of marriage. A 40-year marriage, you're probably all of the pensions getting divided. A 10-year marriage, it's just the marital portion that would get divided. It also depends whether it's in payout status. So if you have an older couple, which we're seeing a lot of those divorces lately, they call them gray divorces. But if someone is in payout status, we're typically not then dividing the pension. We're treating that as income. And so now we're looking at that for purposes of alimony and support, and not a division of an asset, because it's no longer just the asset. It's already being paid out. So every once in a while you'll see something where they do it differently, but that's typically how those get treated.
So we were talking about splitting the assets, right? So that's one component. Is it usually like a 50-50 split if someone's been married for a long time, or?
That's where you start. And then from there, it's what's the rest of their story. So if you have a person who there's assets, let's say, and they've been married 40 years, and now somebody's disabled and can't work, and the other person continues to work, now you start to shift that 50-50, because the way I would argue it is the person who's disabled no longer has that earning capacity and the potential to save. So let's shift that. Like let's make it a 60-40. Let's sometimes fault is a factor, not often, but it has to be so egregious. If someone has done something so egregious in their marriage that the court says, okay, it would be unfair to just split things down the middle, then the court could shift some of the assets over to the other side who's not at fault. You don't often see anything beyond a 60-40 split. Sometimes you'll see something, but very, very rarely. So I always tell clients, listen, worst case scenario, 50-50. And then let's figure out if there's a reason to shift things a little bit one way or the other.
How about alimony? How does that work?
Yeah. So what's really interesting, and so I've been practicing over 20 years now, and when I started, alimony was kind of just a given. It was like, who's the higher income earner? The other person pays it. Half the length of the marriage was the standard that's used. And I think there has been a huge shift in the past, I'd say 5 years or a little bit more, in that alimony is no longer just an automatic. The longer your marriage, the more likely there's alimony. But now you're starting to see courts do something where we're going to give alimony to help you get back on your feet, and we're gonna cut it down. So lifetime. I can't remember the last time I've seen a judge order lifetime alimony. It's just not the norm anymore. So now it's like this rehabilitative. What can we give you to help you finish that degree, go back to work, get the benefits, in order so that you're not dependent on this other person. So the conversations around alimony have definitely changed.
Yeah, I've had some clients that have been divorced and they've gotten alimony, some for a long time. But that was a number of years ago.
Yeah, and it depends. It's so fact specific on the couple, on the income. If you have someone who's earning $500,000 and the other person never earned more than 30, that's a very different conversation than someone who's been out of the workforce for 5 years, but then left a job where they were earning $150,000 and can go back to that.
That gets factored in. Yeah.
Right.
So what else, Renee? What else is important? There's a lot to know, but
it's all important. Health insurance is a huge conversation that is often that thing that really gets us stuck when we're trying to resolve, because it's expensive. And if someone has it through their employer, we can't forget that the other person then has to get their own health insurance, and that has to be factored in. And so it might feel like to the person who has the health insurance, and they may be like, well, wait a second, I'm giving up a lot of support or a majority of the income. But the reality of it is that this person is maybe spending, especially if they have health issues, $1,000, $2,000 a month in order to get comparable health insurance. And so that's like the global perspective of, at the end of it, it's not a who's going to take the other person for the most. It's how are the two of them going to launch into the world and be able to afford their bills. That person who's spending $1,500 in health insurance isn't living some grand lifestyle because they're getting more, because it's just a premium. So it's things
Definitely.
like that.
And I mean, right now with the Affordable Care Subsidy, it's a little more affordable than it was even a couple of years ago. I guess that makes it your job more difficult because we don't know if that's going to continue, I think, past, next year, unless Congress extends it.
Right. And I just had a client in who has some major health issues. And so insurance, she needs really good insurance. And she needs something that's going to be comparable to what she has now with her husband, who's a state employee. And it's so expensive for her to get that. Because she can't just take that, assuming she's just a healthy individual that gets like your basic insurance. She needs more than that.
Yeah. So, I'm assuming just helping your client too, just figure out their cash flow as well. Okay, you're going to have these assets. How are you going to manage this? Because you don't want to run through the money too quickly. It might hey, I'm great. I got $1 million. But if you have high expenses, that might go very quickly. And now what do you do when that runs out?
Right. And that's always the conversation that usually gets tied into the house. It's you're staying in a house that maybe isn't affordable. And people think that, a lot of people want to hold on to it because they think, this is where the kids are going to want to stay because it's their home. But now they're running into, they have the snow plowing and the taxes and the new roof and the new furnace and all of those expenses. So there's so much emotion tied to the money. And a lot of what the work that I do is really helping clients, let's unravel what that emotional thing that you're attaching to in order to figure out what is practical once you get divorced. What does life look like? And if it were me, I'd rather have a healthy cash flow and live in a much smaller place and be able to go on vacation or not have that crunch because I'm house poor. And some people don't think that, and especially if they're not the person who has been intimately involved with the finances, and they need someone. And I love to refer them to people who are in that financial world, help them with the budget, can help them with investing, can help them, figure out how much they need to retire so that they can have a team with them so that they're not left just kind of living paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah, definitely. If you're not paying the bills, sometimes you don't realize how expensive it is to live your lifestyle.
I know.
It's more expensive than ever with everything going up.
Yeah, and people a lot of people will think that their lifestyle that they have as a married couple will be the same when they're two single, and that's usually not the case. There's not enough to go around often, so people have to get comfortable with the idea of downgrading their lifestyle, and that's where you have a lot of anger come in, and that's where you have the emotion because someone's like, well, it's not my fault. I didn't want the divorce. I wasn't the one who had the affair, but yet I have to adjust my lifestyle because of it.
Yeah, that's a difficult thing. Well, awesome.
It sure is.
This has been a great discussion. Anything else before we wrap up this episode?
I would just say for anyone listening, take control of your finances. You have a legal team, you have a financial team, but don't just allow everyone else to tell you what to do. Really own it and educate yourself so that you can have educated decisions. I don't ever want to tell a client you should do A, B, or C. I want them to understand all of their options so they get to make the decision. So really take responsibility for what your finances are. And that's top of mind because I've heard that come up the past couple times in the past couple weeks was that someone saying that, well, I've never had to deal with this before, so you tell me what to do. And I'm like, no, that I don't want to do that, just like you don't want to do that. It's just really learning so that this divorce could be an opportunity to reset everything, and now you get to decide what your financial future looks like and what your money story looks like. So really take ownership of all of that.
I like that. Yeah, and listen to your attorney as much as possible because I've had some people go through divorce and they don't want to listen to what their attorney says because they want it to end quickly, but you gotta, that's why you're paying your professionals. Yeah.
Right, and don't throw in the towel too quickly just to get it over too. I mean, you do see that, and they give up too much because they just want it done.
Awesome. If people want to reach out to you, where's the best place to contact you?
So my website is familylawyerct.com. You can Google us. I'm on Instagram as well under Ms. Renée Bauer, so I'm always over there answering questions.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, Renee. And I really enjoyed this discussion. And
thanks for having me.
And as a reminder for anybody, if you have a listener question, you can always go to retirewithryan.com, click on Ask a Question. And next week, we'll be continuing this 3-part series on divorce with talking about what you should consider, after you've gone through the process of getting divorced. Have a great week, and I look forward to talking with you next Wednesday. Thanks again, Renee.
Thank you.